Hello buzzers, John here. Got some interesting questions on the Tech Lounge regarding cutouts. Particularly they came from Paul Cecil and Emma Brewer. And this is a shot that Emma sent through because making cutouts is effectively separating a subject from its background and then placing on a new background or into a montage, or in some way you're placing the cutout item into a new image to make it look like a real photograph. So you're looking for a photoreal effect. Now, this one that Emma's taken, the shot of a dog, is basically, it's a cutout nightmare. And that's why it makes a great example for this technique. So this is a bit high end and it's going to use some really clever tools within Photoshop. But what we're going to try and do is extract this dog with all its flyaway hairs from this existing background and place it into a new background. Maybe we'll create some sort of studio style background to get like a studio style shot from this picture. So how do we go about it? Well, the first thing we need to do is bring our layers panel up on screen. So if we go up to window and choose layers, once the shot is open in Photoshop, we get our layers panel. There we go, that's the layer, that's our background layer, that's our picture. So the next thing we want to do is decide what background we want to put it on. I always do that first. I make a decision, or a rough decision at least, about the kind of background I'm going to use. Because the kind of background you use for a cutout, the new background, will have an impact on how you make the cutout and how well refined the cutout is. So you want to kind of see a rough idea of what the subject is going on in order to make a good cutout in the first place. So I'm going to quickly change this into an editable layer. At the moment it's kind of a fixed layer, it's a background layer. So to make it an editable layer, the first thing I need to do is hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and then just double click where it says background. That's a really fast way of making it a floating layer rather than a non-editable background layer. So we've done that and now we need to create our background, and I'm going to do a quick kind of studio background here. So I'll create a new layer by clicking on this icon here. That gives me layer 1. Because it's going to be a background rather than a foreground, I need to drag that under the subject. So I've dragged it down and we now have layer 1 sitting beneath layer 0. So we got our background, which at the moment is blank, sitting beneath our dog. Okay, so let's just switch off the dog for the time being, and what we're going to do is make ourselves a kind of a studio style background. So I'm going to do this quite quickly. I think I've got black and white at the moment. Let's change that color. What should we have? Let's pick a blue. Let's have a sort of a dark blue kind of color. That'll do, something like that. So from the color picker, I've selected a dark blue simply by clicking on the background color swatch. I'll click OK. And that gives me black as a foreground color, blue as a background color, and now I'm going to kind of blend the two together using clouds. So we pop up to filter, down to render, and across to clouds. And that generates kind of a mottled cloudy pattern using the black and the blue. So that's fine, it looks a bit sharp at the moment, so I'm just going to blur that a bit now. So we go to filter, down to blur, and we'll choose Gaussian blur. And how many? Oh, that's sort of okay there. I want a bit of definition, but not too much. That sort of thing will do. Okay, so just set the radius to wherever you get a nice blurry result. Click OK, and that will process, and we've got ourselves a sort of a mottled bluey background. Now I can refine that further, but I'll do that later on because I just want to get the basic sort of idea of a background. So that'll do me for now. I'll switch on the top layer now, and we now have our dog visible. So we click on that as well. You can switch it on, but make sure you've clicked on it so that layer is active. And what we're going to do now is pick a selection tool. Now there are lots to choose from when you're making selections. So they're generally up here. We've got the marquee tool, we've got the lasso tool, and we've got this one here. And here, if you mouse down on it, you'll see it's got a quick selection tool or a magic wand tool. Now I'm going to use the top one, the quick selection tool. And I've got two choices now. I can click on select subject from the options bar, and that will allow Photoshop to make its best guess at what the subject is and what the background is. That often works, unless it's a very complex kind of selection you have to make. It often works quite well. The other alternative is I can simply paint over the subject so it defines what is subject and what is background. But the easiest way is to try select subject first and see how it gets on. So I've clicked on the button and now it's going to try and pick out whatever the subject is from the background. And that isn't a bad job at all. You can see there, it's put marching ants, it's made a selection of the dog, and it's taken in a lot of the flyaway hairs, probably enough to go with. Yep, I'm happy with that. So I will now live with that selection. If you find it's gone a bit wrong, then you just need to make some adjustments to the selection. So for example, if it's selected this bit as well, then you'd need to remove that. So if that's the kind of effect you get after you've clicked on the select subject button, then what you'd need to do is use these tools up here. You've got the add to the selection and subtract from the selection, and you would then make amendments to that part there. So in this example, if we got that as our selection, I'd click on the minus icon, the subtract from selection one, and I'd just then start drawing over this bit here to get rid of it. And I'd try and refine it down so I just had the subject and not lumps of the background as well. And now if I zoom in, I'm just using the scroll wheel on the mouse to do it. We've got a little bit more tidying up to do, and we can get ourselves a reasonable selection. Hasn't got to be super accurate, it's just got to be reasonable. And that will do. That will be okay. So I'll zoom back out, and now we're going to go into the magic part of the process, and I'm hoping it's going to work. So let's go now to select and mask. We've got our subject selected. We can see marching ants around it. We've got a definite sort of a cut-off point between the foreground and the background. And we now click on this button here called select and mask. And that brings up a big palette. Now the view we've got here, if I just scroll up to the top of the control panel, you can see we've got different views. The view you may get will be overlay or on black or on white. There are lots of different ways of looking at how the subject works with the layer underneath. But I like to use the onion skin view because that gives me the option of looking at my original background, the thing I'm cutting the subject out from, or I can slide it across and see my new background. And that's the kind of view I want, because that allows me to make my cutout in accordance with the background I've put in place. So that's the view I'm going to use, and I'm going to move the transparency slider. It doesn't really matter where you put it, but I'm going to stick it over to 100% because that will give me a decent view of what's happening with my cutout as I'm moving along. So you can see here at the moment it's looking a bit choppy. You know, we can see that it's not a good cutout. If I hold down the spacebar, I can scroll around the image, and though it's okay, there's lots of the existing background still kind of intermingled with the hairs around the dog. It doesn't look realistic, and that wouldn't be acceptable. It doesn't look like a real photograph. So what we need to do is zoom in a bit, and we're going to use this special tool here. This is the Refine Edge Brush tool. And what this does is this does its best to use very complex algorithms to separate the subject from the background. But we have to use it quite gently and quite slowly, and we have to set the size to about the right kind of size we need. I'm going to go for about that, and I'm just going to I'll start on this ear, and I'm just going to work on the edge. And as I go around the edge, it will start computing, number crunching, and processing to try and separate the subject from the background. Now the best thing to do is work quite slowly and quite methodically, and what I'm looking to do is remove the green. Now I'm introducing errors. You can already see them, these kind of cloudy blobs that are appearing. That's stuff from the old background where the software algorithm can't quite work out what's background and what's foreground. But it's doing an okay job, and that's all it has to do at this stage. So we'll hold down the spacebar to scroll around, and I'm just going to continue and try and take in all of these stray hairs. There we go, they just start appearing. I'm mousing down all the time and just kind of wiggling the brush about along that edge just to reveal those kind of issues and problems. And there we go, we're actually painting out the background and revealing all those stray strands of hair from this, looks like a Westie, I think it is. I'm not very good with dog breeds. If I've got that wrong, my apologies, Emma. There we go, and we're just bringing it in. You can see a tinge of green on some of the hairs. Don't worry about that. The idea is to get it as good as we can, not get it perfect at this stage. So now we hold down the spacebar to scroll around a bit. You find there is lots of processing going on. What we need to do is keep moving around the edge of the subject to try and obtain an effective and realistic looking selection. You can see that's working quite well. Don't keep the mouse down all the time. Take the mouse off to give it a chance to process, and eventually you'll get there and it will hopefully make a decent fist of separating the subject, the foreground subject, from the background. You can see there that's working quite effectively, and we're just following that edge, wiggling the brush about as we go, mousing down and trying to bring about a good looking selection that works. So we'll carry on. That's revealing those hairs there. That's great. Let's get rid of that bit of background in there. We've got that kind of green foliage coming through the shot. We don't want that in there. And as we go through, you can see that we are actually revealing all sorts of detail and creating a good sense of separation between subject and background. Now, it's not a super fast process, but compared to manually selecting each and every one of those strands of hair, it's very, very quick when you compare the two options. So that looks pretty good there. I'll now just scroll over to any parts I've missed. Yeah, there's this bit down here. So we'll work on this edge as well. That's a slightly fuzzier edge there. That's the depth of field. That's just dropped out of focus. So we'll work along that edge. And then we can scroll up a bit more and work on this part here. There we go. And that's just bringing that detail back in and giving me a relatively natural looking edge. And when it comes to the maths, the numbers that are being crunched in doing this, Photoshop is rather impressive in its capability, as I'm sure you can see. But that's the sort of thing, and I think we're just about there. So I'll let that last bit process, and then I'll zoom back to have an overall view. Now I can see some errors. I'm expecting to see some errors, but this is great, this area here. The little blob there that's not quite right, and a couple of bits here and there around the edge. Bit of greenness in there. Let's have a slightly bigger brush. So I'll just use the right square brackets key to go up in brush size. That's the sort of thing. I'll just try in that little bit there. Just see if I can improve that slightly. There we go. And on the whole, that isn't too bad a job. So though I could probably refine that a little bit more, I'm going to accept that. And now I'm going to go down here and I'm going to tick another box down at the bottom of this panel, the control panel, called Decontaminate Colors. So I'll tick that because that normally does a better job of separating foreground from background. And did you see that difference? You've got a slight brightening around the edge, and that's looking pretty effective. We could almost get away with that as it is. But there's more refinement we could do. So what I'm going to do is pop back up to the view mode, and I'm going to see black and white. So I'm going to click on that, and now I can see my mask. This is the mask I've created, and that reveals immediately the kind of errors within the scene. And you can see here there's a blob there, there's a couple of blobs here, bit there, bit there, bit there. These are all parts that I can clean up, and I can clean them up using this brush here. So we click on that brush, and if I then zoom in a bit, I can paint over these areas. Now at the moment I'm on the plus icon, which will give me white. That will paint in the dog area. What I want is the minus icon to give me black. And then I can paint out these errors like so. But I don't have to use this particular brush. I can do this instead using a layer mask. And that's normally a quicker and more successful approach. So I'm happy with the overall mask I've got. So I'll go back to my normal view. Let's just pop back to onion skin. So I think we're just about done there. I can clean up using my layer mask if I output to a layer mask. So that's what I'm going to do next. And to do that, we scroll down to the bottom of the control panel, and we have here an output to box. And this gives me lots of options. The one I'm going to choose is new layer with layer mask, because that's going to retain everything I've got. So I make sure that option is active, and then I'm going to click OK. And that's now output the cutout with a layer mask. So the mask here, the black parts are eliminating the original background, which is still lying underneath, and the white parts are revealing what's present. That's the dog and the dog hair around the edge. So I can now make sure that mask is active, make sure you're not on the layer but on the mask itself, and I can zoom in and do any cleaning up I want to do. And you can see here we've got this kind of cloudy area, and to do this we can use normal brushes. So we select a brush, And I've just got sort of a regular soft edge brush here, just a soft round brush, absolutely standard, nothing clever going on. I can adjust the brush size and I can simply start removing those bits. Now my opacity is a bit low at the moment. Let's just take it up to 100 for our first pass. I can paint out any areas where we can see those obvious errors. So we work around the edge first of all with a 100% opacity brush, just to quickly remove any real obvious kind of bits that are hanging over from the existing background, from the old background. So that looks okay on that side. I'll move along the top. I'm looking right at the edge. That's all pretty good. Little bit here. Let's just remove that. That's like a bit of bokeh really, or bokeh, however you like to pronounce it, or an oofa, as we like to say in Photobuzz. That's an out of focus area. So remove the oofas and get rid of these like cloudy sort of inconsistencies where it's picked up the old background. That's a bit there, a little bit down here as well, and that's pretty good. I'm quite happy with that, and that looks like quite a naturalistic result, and I can't really complain about the job Photoshop's done there. If you find you need to work a little bit harder on those bits, let's say this bit here, that's not looking quite natural, don't be afraid to remove things that aren't really working. So if I want to take down the opacity of my masking brush, take it down to about sort of 30% or so, I can just run that over there a few times just to fade it away, or indeed I can remove it altogether if I want. Just take it out. If there's anything that you think isn't looking good, or you think there's anything that's detracting from the composite image, that's the the picture of the dog on the new layer, just remove those parts. Give the dog a haircut. And the same applies, of course, if you're doing it with a portrait, with a human subject. It'd be exactly the same process. There we go. And we can just remove those kind of areas if they're bothering us or if they're looking slightly unnatural. Okay, so that's all looking pretty good. There's a nice cutout going on there, and the job is effectively done. So we've gone from this, that's our original, and we've turned it into this. And that is looking fantastic. The thing that isn't looking very fantastic is our new background, our motley, cloudy thing. But we can quickly do a couple of tweaks just to spruce that up a bit. And to achieve that, the first thing I'm going to do is click on this background layer, so it's active. And then what do we want to do? We want a slight crop maybe. So we'll run over to the crop tool and we'll take out a bit of that edge, just bring that across. That's a bit better balanced. We'll double click to make that crop happen. And then, let me see, I could do with kind of a spot effect, kind of like a flash background. So what I'll do, I'll grab the lasso tool, the regular lasso, and I'm just going to kind of do a blob around this sort of zone here. Something like that'll do, just kind of a spot effect on the background. I need to feather this like mad. So again, I'm going to go to select and mask to create a feather. So onto select and mask. I'll go back to my normal view actually now. So let's just go back up to the top and I'll go to the overlay view. That shows me how hard or how soft my edge is. So we got overlay set as our view mode. We go to the feather slider and let's ramp that up. Nice broad feather. I think something like that should do the trick. That's about right. I've got about sort of 200 pixels or so. Click OK to that. We've now feathered that selection. And if I want to add a spot effect, all I've got to do is change the brightness or the contrast or whatever on this central portion. So to do that, I'm just going to click on the adjustment layer icon and I'm going to pick curves. Curves is a great sort of catch-all command that does all sorts of things. So if I move the white point slider over to the left, I start brightening that central area so I get my spot effect and I can ramp it up a little bit in the middle. That's the kind of thing. That's looking all right. I can go dark or bright. I think that looks quite nice like that. Something like that should do the trick. So I've got my spot effect in it. The other thing I want to do now is darken the whole edge to give a kind of a vignette to the background. I don't want to vignette the whole image. I just want to vignette the background. So to do that, all I'm going to do is crunch this curves layer, this adjustment with the background. That's easy. That's Control or Command and E to knock those two together. And then I'm going to just do the quickest and simplest way to add a vignette, and that's to go to Filter, down to Camera Raw Filter, and click on that. This is the easiest way to add a darkening of the edges. There's my background, and all I'm going to do is click on the Effects tab in the Camera Raw processor, and then drag the amount slider over to the left, and that darkens the edge. You see that darkening going on? You can make it bright or you can make it dark. That's the kind of thing I want there. That just thickens the edge, darkens it down, and then I'll click OK. That gives me a nice sort of dark vignette around the edge of the background. So we've got a nice kind of studio background spot effect there, and a good looking cutout of the dog. It's a good idea to save all your layers when you've done this, because you've still got the flexibility to change it. You've got your cutout made, that's all done, so you can put that onto another image or a different background, or you can change other aspects. For example, if you say, well, maybe the blue isn't right, maybe I don't want a blue cloudy background, I want a different colour instead, that's easy to achieve. Just make sure that background layer is active and selected, then click on the adjustment layer icon and choose the hue saturation option. This brings up our hue sat palette, and if you just move the hue slider around, you can change the background color. Maybe go for something else. Let's go for that kind of pinky red. Why not? And we can change the saturation to take down that, make it black and white, make it bold red, whatever you want to do really. But looking at that, it's looking a bit contrived now because we've got the background working perfectly with the collar. I'm going to go back to my original blue. So let's just move that back down to where we started from and leave it alone. So we'll stick with the blue. I like the way that contrasts better. So we won't change that, but I'm just showing you a way you could change it if you wanted to. So with that done, all we got to do is output the file. And as I said, I suggest you save your layers. So when you go to File, Save As, choose the PSD format, the Photoshop document format, and that will save the whole thing. When you decide you want a JPEG, instead, all you have to do, you don't have to crunch down your layers, just go to JPEG as the option, and that will output a JPEG of the flattened image without having to crunch down all your layers first. So we can simply, we call that image cutout, for example. That will do. And we just save that as a JPEG. Click Save. And it'll give you your JPEG options. Quality, always go for between 10 and 12. 12 will take up lots of space. 10 will look hardly any different and take up much less space. So that would do nicely. Maximum quality 10. Click OK. And we now have output a JPEG of that file with all its glorious cutout in place. So I hope that made sense. A lot of ground covered within that video, but essentially the thing I want you to remember is that you can use that wonderful refine edge brush within the select and mask palette. It is fantastically powerful and makes fairly light work of really, really difficult cutouts. The kind of cutouts that would be almost impossible to do in other software. You couldn't do this in Lightroom, for example. There's no way you could do it in Lightroom. But by using these layers, I know it's a complex looking layers palette, but by using these layers and that wonderful select and mask palette, you can generate something quite special relatively quickly. It's worth giving it a try. Find yourself a difficult cutout and just wade in with the select and mask palette using that refine edge brush and see if you can generate that same kind of effect and get yourself a great looking cutout. I mean, look at that. The edge is fantastic. All those flyaway hairs are there, all on a brand new background. And remember, we still have the one we started with. There it is there. That's our original shot. And when we look at the cutout we've produced, there it is. So there's lots of technology employed, but I think you'll agree it's a pretty impressive result. All right, thanks for watching. That's complex, really hard to do cutouts made relatively simple. Hope it all made sense for you. Give it a try. See you soon.